Vernomatic Productions.
Are you ready?
Live from the Metal Mayhem Studios in Rochester, New York.
We are gold. We are gold.
And heard around the world by metalheads just like you. This is Metal Mayhem ROC.
Heavy metal music.
Your weekly dose of metal music, interviews, album reviews, news, and more. Want to be part of the show? Send us a message through our website, metalmayhemroc.com, or hit us up on Facebook and Twitter. Search Metal Mayhem ROC, a proud member of the Pantheon podcast team.
It's getting nice and heavy.
Now, welcome our hosts, John the Vernomatic Verno, and direct from New Jersey, Metal Walt.
Good evening, everybody. Here we are, middle of February. There's snowstorms everywhere. It's cold. We're looking forward to spring, so that will come soon enough. But tonight we got a good one. Metal Walt's back with the guys from the History of Metal team, and they're going to explore the year 1998. Metal Walt, tell us about it. What do you got in store for us tonight?
1998 was a big year because it involved so much stuff around Ozzy and Black Sabbath. Ozzfest was touring the country in the summer. Later in the year, Sabbath announces a reunion tour with Bill Ward. We got all this in one calendar year. But even bigger, John, Van Halen had a huge change in their lineup this year. Huge.
Oh, Gary Cherone, Van Halen 3. God, 1998. What was that, like 30 years ago, 25 years ago? Just doesn't seem that long ago. What else you cover in this episode, 1998?
Well, again, it's about the continued rise in the new metal bands like System of a Down, Godsmack, Kid Rock. They're what's in this year. And also a very big and controversial event at the time where Rob Halford came clean and announced his sexuality on live TV.
Wow, I don't even remember that. I'm going to have to pay a little more attention to this. Well, this sounds interesting. So, again, our long-running series, History of Metal, you go back to the website, metalmayhemroc.com, and we started this series back in 1973, like 2.5 years ago. So that's all up there. While you're there, check out our Etsy page. Tons of merch. Just the other night, we had a sale for this father-son family purchase over in Spain. So we do sell over in Europe. And also, while you're there, sign up for the newsletter. That will get you updates on our everything we're doing here, on new episodes, YouTube videos, alerts for the radio show. So again, that's metalmayhemroc.com. And listen, if you dig what we're doing here, do us a favor, subscribe to the pod and leave us a review. All right, well, let's see. In the next couple weeks, what do we got? Metal Walt, you got one next week. What do we have?
We have a prominent member of the Vinnie Vincent invasion for his controversial story. And then coming down the line, John, we have a bunch of rock and roll and heavy metal legends. Episodes with these guys, conversations coming up down the line.
Awesome. So next week, we got the Vinnie Vincent guy. And in 2 weeks, I have Robin McAuley from McAuley Schenker fame. His third solo album's out. For my co-host, Metal Walt, I'm the Vernomatic, and we are Metal Mayhem ROC.
Good evening, everyone. So tonight we're taking an in-depth look at the year 1998 and what it meant for the state of hard rock and heavy metal. As usual, there's an overabundance of new music. It was a bit of a down year in terms of major releases standing out, but there was definitely still some good hidden gems. Modern rock and new metal remained at the top of the chart. Let's get right to some of the highlights in terms of big things that happened. I think there were two things that we can all appreciate. Ozzfest was now officially off the ground, right? This was now a touring act, and this was hitting the sheds this year. The prior year in 1997, it was in the stadiums. This year it was in the sheds, and it featured not Black Sabbath, but it featured Ozzy's solo band headlining, but you also had Tool and Megadeth and Motorhead. So it was a different lineup. But if that wasn't enough, Sabbath dropped the Reunion live album, which, again, we covered the live show on the last episode, the ones from Birmingham, England. But they released that album and then announced a U.S. headlining tour with Bill Ward back in the band. So although that tour wouldn't officially start until New Year's Eve 1998, all the hype was there. So, guys, talk a little bit about your, let's say, your remembrance of this Sabbath reunion and tour, and also the Ozzfest.
I saw the Ozzfest in Orlando, and if I remember correctly, it was in July, and it was just in a big giant field, and it was brutally hot. It was wicked hot. And just I remember waiting in line, and just people, everybody was sweating to death, and a lot of body odor and a lot of weed hanging in the air. But it was a fun time. It was a good one. The highlight for me was Tool. They were freaking, that was probably their for me, it was their high watermark. And yeah, Motorhead was great. I remember seeing Motorhead, Megadeth, Soulfly. I wasn't really a big fan, but they were pretty good that day. But Tool was freaking awesome. Maynard came out dressed like I don't know what the hell he was wearing, like lingerie or something, with high heel boots and a wig, and dude was a freak. But it was a sick show, very good show.
And it also, looking at the roster, it also included like some of the new metal bands like Limp Bizkit, Seven Dust, Life of Agony, Incubus, Snot, Cold Chamber, the Melvins. So they were also moving away from the traditional metal acts. Ian?
Yeah, well, I was going to just reiterate, like I remember having high hopes when they released the 2 new tracks on the reunion CD. And I was hoping that there would be something that would be announced later on as they went through the Ozzfest with all the, performing and everything else. But unfortunately, nothing ever came to fruition with the original members again at that point, which was sad, because I was really looking forward to it, because I thought that the material I thought was on point, because it felt like a graduation from where old Sabbath never got to, and what Sabbath with Dio had been doing right before they decided to call it quits. So I thought the material was pretty decent overall. It's a lot better than the stuff, that Rick Rubin album that came out, later on. I'll tell you that much.
And you're referring to the songs Psycho Man and Selling My Soul, which were extras on the Live 98 CD.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I don't know. I don't recall off the top of my head. Did Bill Ward play on those tracks? I feel like maybe he didn't.
I thought I was pretty sure that he did, but I would have to go back and do some homework on that one. But I thought that it was the original, because that was kind of the precursor. I think when they were in the studio, practicing, warming up, I think they had worked on some material, and that was something that was thrown together. And it almost, believe it or not, I mean, you can, probably appreciate this, that whole Iomi project that he did, later on, and Glenn Hughes was involved, and, all that stuff. It was very reminiscent to that kind of, I mean, Tony's got his vibe, so I mean, he's not going to depart from it, but I thought that the material sounded really good, but I'll have to double check on the cast of characters for that one.
Yeah. I mean, a highlight for me was I flew down to Phoenix, Arizona for the opening night of the tour. And it fell on New Year's Eve. So technically it was still 1998, but really 99. But I went down with my buddies. But what a package, guys, on New Year's Eve. Wasn't just Sabbath, but you had Pantera, Megadeth, Slayer, and Soulfly. It was the only show on that tour that featured all of those bands. As it got into February of 99, they took Pantera out as the support. But seeing that show on New Year's Eve in a baseball stadium in the summer heat, the winter heat in Phoenix, 80, 85 degrees at night, was something special, man. And there was a couple songs I remember they played that night. I think Killing Yourself to Live was performed at that show and never done again. So definitely caught a couple gems there.
Nice.
Yeah. So, hey guys, the other big news was it was something that occurred on MTV in passing. Rob Halford, in a passing interview, no big announcement made. He just, in passing conversation on whatever topic he was talking about, maybe it was to talk about the upcoming 2 industrial metal project, just came out on air and announced that he was gay. I know it sent big waves through the industry and the metal community. Bill, what do you remember from that period when this news hit?
I just remember being like, all right, that I already knew he was gay. Well, I figured he was. So it wasn't a big shock to me. I was glad for him to be able to come out and say that. I'm sure it was a big weight off his shoulders. But my brother and I, we kind of figured way back in 1980 that Rob Halford was gay. And when you listen to the lyrics of Living After Midnight, we're like, I figured he was gay back then. But, you didn't know for sure until he said that. So,
Right.
I just remember Scott Ian, coming out in I forget what it was, just some little metal special that they had on TV, and he said he goes, here's the guy that set the template and created the uniform for what headbangers around the world were going to wear. He goes, oh, and surprise, surprise, he comes out years later and tells everybody that he's gay. He goes, like nobody knew. And I go, yeah, well, you really could have put him in a line with the Village People, with the get up, I mean, it would have worked perfectly. But I really, honest to God, I don't think most metal fans gave a shit. They were like,
No.
whatever, diddle who you got.
If anyone cared, then they weren't a fan anyway,
Yeah, right.
Different period of time there. And, people weren't openly talking about topics like that. So it was a little bit different there, too.
Yeah,
but, again, I think we were still in the mindset that, well, Rob's not in Judas Priest. He's got this industrial project coming out looking like Trent Reznor with the thick makeup. And that would come out, I think it was that year, maybe the year before. I don't remember. That's where my mindset was on Rob, not whether he was gay or not. It was like, oh, well, this 2 project is kind of weird. But definitely was big news for the year. And
it definitely put a different spin on when you looked at the 2 project. You're kind of like, okay, because it kind of fit with the whole goth industrial kind of vibe of what was going on in the scene with some of those people. So,
yeah, exactly. The other big event, guys, was a beloved band of all of ours. Maybe Ian, closest to your heart, was the mighty Van Halen. So they returned with a new album and a new singer, Gary Cherone. So I just know when I got this news initially, it's funny thinking about it all these years later. It was like maybe I just wasn't in a Van Halen mode at that time. It was almost like I didn't care. I was like, oh yeah, that was cool. But I think there was like the immature, younger metal Walt was a little bit always embarrassed a little bit of Gary Cherone because he had weird antics and the way he pranced and danced on stage with Extreme. And of course, they had those kind of soft radio hits. You couldn't admit to liking them, whether or not they were cool. And it was almost like, oh man, Gary Cherone, like that's corny. That's not Van Halen. Years later, you look at it and you're like, this guy's a magnificent singer, great performer. Guys, what did you think of the selection?
I'll honest to God, I remember listening to the album. I remember trying to absorb it. Thought it was, okay, slightly an extension of what they did with Balance, which was the last album with Sammy before this. I kind of was able to accept the fact because Nuno already had experience working with a Guitar Hero in Nuno Bettencourt. Or excuse me, Gary did with Nuno. So I figure, okay, I know that he's got the ability to try to pull it off, and he definitely has the charisma of a frontman. I just think that the overall temperament of the songs was a little dour. It wasn't what I was expecting it to be, especially bringing Gary into the band, knowing what he could do. I thought that there could have been a little bit more pop to it, a little more, but overall, I mean, I was able to accept it, like I said, just because I know his fandom puts him in that, they loved Queen, they loved Van Halen. These are, they loved Aerosmith. Those were the bands that they basically set their mark for. So
I think to me, there's only really one standout track on the album, and that's Fire in the Hole. That one had that, traditional Van Halen type riff. It's just strong, and Gary Cherone really brought the muscle in his singing on that one. I like that one. The single Without You, it was okay, but I didn't think it was really kind of like a strong single to lead and bring this new singer into the mainstream, audience. I mean, I had a personal spot for the acoustic track Josephina, because that was my late mother's name. So I always thought that was a cool one. But Bill, what about you? What about you on this album? Any favorites, highlights, lowlights?
Well, just the initial, when I heard about that, I was shocked. I was like, Gary Cherone, what? I just didn't picture it. And yeah, I just, that the album's not bad. It's not terrible. It's just, to me, it's very forgettable. It's not very memorable. There's some good guitar work on it. The song Dirty Water Dog, it's got a cool effect on his guitar, and kind of a watery sound or whatever. But overall, it's, I think of Van Halen, I think of like bright colors. That album is gray. It's kind of dull and gray. And not because of Gary Cherone. I just think they were all in a bad mindset, maybe, or something. I don't know. It's too bad that
how about
didn't
the
work
tour?
out. But
did you guys see the tour? I saw the tour at the PNC Bank Arts Center, and that summer, Kenny Wayne Shepherd opened. Earlier in the year, they played the Garden. And I believe, if my memory corrects me right, Creed opened that show, which they were early on in their career. But what I loved about this show was they brought back, certain Dave songs that hadn't been done with Sammy. And I remember they opened with Unchained, I believe, and brought some other things back. Somebody Get Me a Doctor. So that was cool, just hearing these older tracks. And that was like a period where I was like, wow, well, maybe this could work, because you're going to have new material. And then this guy can sing off on both eras and both prior singers, which I thought was great, because it opened the catalog up to playing different set lists and maybe longer shows.
Yeah, I didn't get a chance to see the tour, but I have seen some of the live video footage like you're talking of. I've seen they did Unchained. The one version of Somebody Get Me a Doctor, Mike Anthony was doing, he took the vocals on it, at least at first, until the chorus and everything came in. But, he would be the guy to do it, though, because he was a fan of that. And I'm sure that in one way or shape or form, he was a fan of the Hagar era as well. So.
Yeah. Hey, Bill, how about the album cover? I mean, that was, if there was something memorable about it, it was kind of cool, right? I think it was his bald guy being shot out of a cannon. Was there a story behind this? I don't really remember.
Yes, and I believe that's a real picture of, I forget the guy's name, that took a cannonball to the gut. I don't think it killed him either. But yeah. But no, I didn't catch them live on that tour, unfortunately. I don't remember them playing Tampa. I'm not saying they didn't, but I don't think they did, because I probably would have been there. But yeah, I would have loved to have seen those tunes played live that you mentioned.
Well, it was definitely, let's call it like a timestamp in the Van Halen history that it often goes unnoticed, but it's an important timestamp here that people, you look at it and it raises conversation about this period, whether you like it or you don't. It's definitely an outlier in their history. But anyway, guys, maybe covering off really quick on, let's call our 80s bands. It was kind of funny. This was like every year we seem to say, well, it's the lowest point this year. It's the lowest point, 95, 96, 97. Well, 98 was the lowest point. I mean, you had releases from 1, 2, 3, 4 bands. 4 80s bands. That was it. None of them memorable. Firehouse, LA Guns, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Sebastian Bach. The era was over. It would come back. We'll get to that in a couple years. But what was dominating the charts, as it was in 1997, was, let's call it, that new modern rock. Again, you got to give credit where credit's due, because you look at artists like Marilyn Manson, Kid Rock, System of a Down, Godsmack, and Rob Zombie. Those guys were all over the radio. They're the bands that were filling up the sheds on these Ozzfest type tours, but every single one of those bands had a unique sound, right? You could never compare Manson. I mean, Manson had his whole thing with the Dope Show, but then Kid Rock emerges, right? He comes out with this sort of, I don't even know what you would call it, more like rap rock with a little bit of like a country twang. What was those songs? Body Dabwa and
all with the bar.
There you go. I couldn't even say it. And then you had somebody like System of a Down who comes in, and they were, I don't know, Armenian, Turkish. They were just talking about all these anti-war and religious themes, but just the way Serge, kind of scattered and sang was like nothing else. And that's why I say this was cool, because it was different. What about you guys? What did you think of these bands?
Yeah, I mean, System of a Down, I think, were they on the Ozzfest or was that the year before? But I saw them a few times in that time period, and they were pretty good live because they were different, definitely different. And then they started playing them on the radio, and I'm like, wow, I couldn't believe I was hearing that on the radio. And yeah, I mean, Kid Rock, I saw him live, and again, hot summer Florida heat, and he's out there in a fur coat. That was interesting. I'm not really a fan, but he put on a hell of a show. Definitely put on a good show, and he had a good band backing him. So I can't slack on that. So, it was an interesting time for rock at the moment.
I think, the with System of a Down, it's kind of like when you look at some of the bands from the 90s, some of the grunge bands, certain singers have a way of not only the way that they project their voice, but it's their phrasing. And that's where Serge Tankian kind of had that. He had this unique, it was like completely different than what anybody else was doing. And then you throw into it this chaotic uh, mashup of metal and whatever else they were doing, throwing in some of their Armenian folk bits in between, and then I mean they all were great. The one band that I definitely did see back then was Godsmack, and I remember somebody we actually played a battle of the bands, and there was a promoter from Universal that was there, and they had like this huge basket, and they were handing out 3-song single cassettes to everybody that was there. Hey, we're promoting this band, blah, blah, blah. We figured we'd give you. So I remember getting that, and I popped it in the car when I was driving home, and I was like, holy shit, these guys are great. I can't wait to get the album, and then the album came out, and then I saw them live, and it was like, okay, maybe they are one of those bands that can kind of hit the mark, when it comes to, going into the next foray of what we call metal, so it was pretty cool though.
And they were like the closest to the cuff of traditional hard rock and metal. I think there was every metal fan could sort of relate to Godsmack. Sully was cool. He was tough. He just had a great look. The band kicked ass and, just good instrumentation. What I always thought I loved about these guys went out on Ozzfest, I think the prior year unsigned. And this was the era where bands had to pay to get on the Ozzfest. They had to pay into the whole Osbourne camp just to get on the bill to play maybe 3 or 4 songs at 2 p.m. But look what this did to their career. I mean, I was looking at the numbers, and again, you got to remember the songs that came out of this. Whatever, Keep Away, and Voodoo, these are all radio-friendly songs that are still played all the time. But this album has sold 5 million copies. I mean, that's a lot. 5 times platinum. I mean, pretty impressive numbers. And it launched their career. I still love them. I go to see them whenever they're around with my wife. She's one of her favorite bands, and I'm just glad that they're still out there doing that.
Yeah, I saw them on that first album. In Tampa, they did a headlining gig at the Ritz Theater, which holds like, I don't know, 1,200 people. Yeah. And I mean, it was a hell of a show. Very good show.
Little side piece. So when my wife and I got married, the other guitar player in Motorlord was my best man. So when he went up to pick a song for my wife and I to dance to, he actually saw that they had Godsmack and he picked Voodoo. So if anybody knows anything about our material on the song Three Queens, when I referenced the last queen, she's the Voodoo Queen. And it was just a nod to my wife. So.
Well, Ian, thanks for that tidbit. So on that note, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back from a commercial break, we're going to get into, there's a lot more material here. We got some of the stalwarts, some of the dark bands, and a lot of good stuff to come.
Metal Mayhem ROC.
So let's get into some of the heavier albums. A couple of my favorites from this year were Anthrax's Volume 8 and Monster Magnet's Power Trip. Ironically, these bands toured. They did a little short theater tour. I was able to catch them both at Irving Plaza in that year. But Ian, I know like Volume 8, we've talked about this one before. It's a great album that I think, maybe by this point in time, the John Bush infatuation was starting to die down, and maybe it was just later in the 90s, people didn't care as much. But there's, to me, I think this is my favorite of the John Bush era. I mean, songs like Crush, Catharsis, Inside Out, even the funny song Cup of Joe. I think this album just end to end is really, really good.
Yeah, I think we discussed this before. I mean, it's one of those albums, that no knock against the Joey stuff. I love all the Joey stuff, but when John came into the band, I remember, when Sound of White Noise came out, and I was like, "Holy shit, this is different," and it had a cool vibe. And I always loved his voice from Armored Saint. Well, going through the albums, when they hit Volume 8, it's almost like the coalescence of what they were working on in material just kind of finally came together in a bigger package that had more content and more consistency in that content. I thought it was a great album, man. Really crushed. And then, rest in peace, Dimebag. I mean, he got his bits in there too with those guys back then.
Yeah. Hey, Bill, what was you being an ex-Jersey guy? I know Monster Magnet has its roots in Jersey and New York. I just remember this album, Dave Weindorf. He built the hype on this album so big himself, it was almost impossible not to go in there brainwashed and think this was going to be the best album ever. Just how we talked about Power Trip, the album cover with the American flag and him up there. And it really is a great album. Songs Crop Circle, Power Trip, and of course their biggest hit ever, Space Lord. I think it's just it's their signature album of their whole career.
Yeah, definitely. They're from Red Bank, New Jersey, which was right next to Middletown where I lived. So I kind of seen them dudes around and stuff. And yeah, I remember him hyping the shit out of that album before it came out. And when it did come out, it was a pretty big album, and there's some great tunes on there. And a little side note, my friend Jim Baglino used to play guitar in Human Remains, and then he played bass in Dead Guy. Played bass for those guys from, I think it was 2001 to 2013. And so I have a fondness for them and for that respect too.
That's very cool. Making it personal. Hey, guys, what about like this whole Max Cavalera story, right? He leaves Sepultura, Derek Green comes in and takes over, yet Max debuts Soulfly this year. Also, staying with the S's, Slayer releases Diabolus in Musica. I always loved that album. I thought the songs Bitter Peace and Stain of Mine was cool. Definitely a little bit of an album that flies under the radar. What'd you guys remember from these bands back then?
I'll go on record saying that I wasn't a big fan of the Slayer album, but I did think that the debut from Derek with Sepultura crushed Soulfly. Soulfly had some great stuff, but it was trying too hard to be in what was going on with the new trends, where Sepultura just kind of stayed the course and they progressed within themselves on that course. And I thought it was a freaking great album, man. I was like, holy cow, this dude is brutal sounding. I mean, as far as being a vocalist, I thought that he did a really good job stepping in there for Max, because Max has his own, character, and this guy came in and he just delivered right off the bat with his music. So I thought it was good.
Yeah, I agree.
Bill, any thoughts?
With the Slayer, I was never a huge fan of that album, but like you said, Bitter Peace and Stain of Mine are good tunes. It just, the whole album to me, it wasn't real solid, I guess. It wasn't memorable like some of the earlier releases, but yeah, I agree with you on Sepultura. I was pretty bummed that Max left when he did, but at the same time, I wasn't really digging where he was taking the band. And then Soulfly, like I said, I saw him live and they were good live, but listening to the album, I just wasn't my thing at the time. I think he was trying too hard to be more like Korn or something, or like, in that realm of things. And I don't know. It's not for me. And I mean, some of their later stuff, I dug more than that early stuff.
Yeah. Guys, there was a couple of let's say debuts this year, and we'll just make mention of them. Primal Fear, power metal band Primal Fear out of Europe, released their self-titled album this year. Union, the collaboration between ex-Kiss guitarist Bruce Kulick and ex-Motley Crue vocalist John Corabi, debuted this year. And probably the biggest one is Black Label Society's Sonic Brew was released. So, Ian, what's your impressions of Sonic Brew? What was your memories of this album?
Well, I think I know that we've had discussion about this before. I stand by that first Pride and Glory album. I think is one of the best albums that came out in the 90s. You know, the way that he was able to deliver being heavy and Southern rock at the same time, it was something that really wasn't going on with a lot of other bands. So I thought it was fantastic. When he was doing this project, I was hopeful it was going to be a little bit more like what Pride and Glory was. It still had some of the vibe to it, but all of a sudden now you could see that where this was the nucleus for what was going to happen the next few years. You know, the second album is still one of my favorites by him ever, but this, when it came out, you know, just some of the riffing on this first album and the way that he was, I appreciate the first few albums better for his vocal than I do later on. I didn't like when he did this, you know, the Stillborn, and he was mimicking Ozzy's tonalities and stuff like that. I thought that he sounded ballsy on these first few albums, and you know, they still stand pretty true to me. And I have one of the original releases that has the Scotch bottle on the front before it got, and I remember, you know, when it came out, I was like, this could go someplace. And, you know, look at what happened with Zach. You know, I mean, he really did a good job with it.
Yeah, to the point where that formula was so, let's say, captured over and over and over again that Ozzy got a little sick of him years going by. And he remembered that was one of the reasons Ozzy said, yeah, Zach, you know, Ozzy's starting to talk, you know, feel too much like Black Label Society. I think it's time for us to get a replacement in here. But it was definitely the beginning of a start of a continued very long career and still going for Black Label. In a second, Bill, we're going to let Bill go in and get his 5 minutes or so of some of his favorite dark and heavy projects, but I want to make mention of a couple of other releases that were important this year. Like we did last year, King Diamond and Merciful Fate also released albums in the same year. I thought that was like a one-time deal. Well, they did it again. King Diamond released the album Voodoo, Merciful Fate, the album Dead Again. One of my favorites that falls just outside the box of metal and hard rock would be Joe Satriani's Crystal Planet, an amazing album. Ian, I'm sure you'd like that one. And the other one was Ice Earth, something this wicked this way comes. This one's great. It's got staple tracks like Burning Times and Watching Over Me. So all good highlights for the year. But Bill, your time is upon us. What do you got for us in your category?
Well, first I'm going to do some honorable mentions because there was a lot of death metal that came out in 1998. And obviously for lack of time, I can only go over a few records, but we had records from Opeth, Gorguts, Incantation, Death, Dying Fetus, Suffocation, who had Dave Culross from Rochester, New York, playing drums on that album. Despise the Sun, it was an EP. Cryptopsy put out an album, Morbid Angel, Napalm Death, Bolt Thrower, Malevolent Creation, Mortification, and Amon Amarth, to name a few. So, right. But anyway, I am going to discuss Fear Factory Obsolete. That was an album that came out that year, and I listened to quite a bit. It was kind of continuation of their previous effort, and it's Man Against Machine kind of a theory or theme, I mean, and it's actually a concept album. The whole album's about the same story, and it's based on basically how computers and machines are taking over man. And it's set in the year 2076, but they're very close to the mark as far as how things are going today and in 2024 with AI all over the place, you know. And you know, it's kind of the story is kind of like a warning to man saying, hey, be careful, you know. But some of the standout tunes on there for me are Edge Crusher. It's got a killer bass line in it, and there's a part in the middle instead of a guitar lead. It's like a mix between scratching and just kind of pounding drums and riff. Then there's the song Descent, which I like. It has a really catchy guitar melody, which is unusual for them guys. They're pretty heavy most of the time, but it has a memorable riff to it. And then the song Obsolete, that's a great tune, heavy. And Securitron, Police State 2000, that's another good heavy one. And again, that's about kind of what's going on now with the cameras everywhere and people watching and, that kind of thing. And anyway, they put out a digipack version that had a cover of the Car song by Gary Newman. Yeah. And if you guys remember that was actually kind of a hit for them, and that made this album go gold. It was actually certified gold because they sold enough copies I think because of that tune. And then if I believe they were on a movie soundtrack and a couple of video game soundtracks. So that was definitely a big album for those guys. Moving on to Nile, and they put out Amongst the Catacombs of Nephron Ka. And this was their first full-length album, and it's a ripper. I don't know if you ever heard of Nile, but this was a sick album, and I remember this album well because my old band Swollen opened up for them at the old Brass Mug in Tampa, Florida, on that tour, and man, that was a good time, very good time. But anyway, this album is lyrically inspired by H.P. Lovecraft and ancient pharaohs and all that stuff. It's the lyrics are pretty deep, but there's some sick tunes on there. Smashing the Antiu, Bara Endinazu, Ramses, Bringer of War. And it's just really super fast, brutal, intense, sick guitar work from Carl Sanders, and just, guttural death metal vocals that I dig. And, I know a lot of people don't like the death metal vocals, but he did it good. And all right, anyway, I'm going to move on to the next one, which was Cannibal Corpse, Gallery of Suicide. And this album, it was their sixth studio album, and it was the first to feature Pat O'Brien on guitar. He was replacing Rob Barrett, who left after the last tour of the Vile album. And it was also their last album to be recorded at Morrisound Studios, and their first album to be recorded without Scott Burns doing the production. Jim Morris actually did the production on this one. And I got to say, they put out a total banger, man, because this album just rips from start to finish. And the tunes like I Will Kill You, which just comes right in and rips your guts out. Sentenced to Burn, Every Bone Broken. It's got some sick slam parts, killer lead guitar. Centuries of Torment's got a sick part at the 253 mark where you just want to start moshing in the pit. And then Crushing the Despised, which has a sick bass part from Alex Webster. And it's just overall, it's a great album, and it's very technical, very heavy, just superb in every which way. Pat came in like a wildfire. So
now you said that they didn't record did they still record down in Florida?
No, that was the last one. That was the last album they did in Tampa. Well, at the time in Tampa, they started recording in Texas after that for a while. And then they've since been recording in St. Pete, but I believe that's going to change too, because I think that studio was sold.
Oh, okay.
But
I just didn't know if I didn't know if they shifted to another studio because with it being their home base down there.
Yeah. Yeah. Morrisound was on its way down at the time. Things weren't as, they weren't as busy. So, or if they weren't doing death metal as much. And Scott Burns really was bowing out of the metal thing. He was getting into the computer world. And but it's a sick album. It's got a great production on it, and kudos to them for that.
What about Stabbing Westward? I know that was a favorite for you for this year. What about this one? What makes this one so good?
Yeah, that was an album that came out at a time when I was going through some dark times, and Darkest Days was the name of that album, and it kind of hit a point with me but I don't know if you remember the song "Save Yourself." It was kind of a hit. It was all over the radio. I remember the NFL grabbed a hold of it, and you'd hear it in between, plays on and during NFL games and stuff. Um, and then they had some other tunes, "Torn Apart," which is a total ripper, "Haunting Me," which was kind of somewhat of a hit song. And "Sometimes It Hurts." And then the ultimate revenge song, "On Your Way Down." I don't know if you ever heard that one, but that's a killer tune. And it's surprisingly, this album didn't really do that well. That song "Save Yourself" was kind of a hit for them, but I think other than that, it didn't really meet expectations, and they end up getting dropped by Columbia Records after that came out, not long after it came out.
Okay.
But I did see them on that tour, and they were great live. Not really my cup of tea. They were sort of like in between the Nine Inch Nails and radio rock kind of thing, but they struck more of a nerve with me than Nine Inch Nails did, I guess, at least for a couple albums.
Yep. Well, Bill, I always look forward to your segment because it's just going to be brutal, and you educate me on things I just don't really connect with. I don't listen to these bands, but from the titles to the songs to the names to the album covers, it's good stuff, man. I really appreciate it. So thank you for that. So, guys, before we went on air, we were talking a little bit about how this was maybe a bit of a softer year in terms of major releases. And we're going to get into, let's say, the heavy hitters, the stalwarts, the traditional bands that we all look forward to hearing about for new music. And there's some good stuff here. But I think what these bands that we're going to talk about now, they rise to the top really just because there's a lack of really major releases that came out this year. And perhaps on a different year, these may not even crack the top 10. But because this is what we're facing in 98, this is what you get. So, Ian, on the topic of Van Halen, I had forgot about this one until the last minute, but David Lee Roth released an album this year. It was called the David Lee Roth Band. Kind of came out of nowhere. It included John Five in there as guitar player and Ray Luzier, who would go on to be his touring band drummer for many years and eventually move over to Korn. They had the single Slam Dunk, which I kind of remember as a cool track. It was a return to more straight-ahead hard rock. And there was a bit of an infatuation and, let's say, a return. This was the beginning of the return of David Lee Roth the way we wanted him back to. What was your impressions of this period of Dave?
Yeah, I think that he was trying to keep himself relevant, trying to make sure that he was putting out a good product, trying to pull in guys, especially with John Five and Ray Luzier. He's pulling in good musicians again to help him realize this dream. Was I overly impressed with it? No. Did I think it stunk? It was okay. It was pretty good. All I remember was it was what I think within the next year of this was the Sammy Hagar, David Lee Roth tour. I think is 99, I believe, where they tried to get that going, and that was, I just remember that being just a debacle, So I mean, that whole thing going on, but yeah, when you hear now, Dave had still worked on some other material with John Five in the studio, and every once in a while he throws these tidbits out there, whether it be a YouTube video or something like that of these songs. And some of them are kind of off the beaten path for what they should be. I'd like to hear some of the more rockin' stuff, because when John Five was in his younger days, I think he wasn't as eccentric playing as he is now, where now he's kind of very formulaic when you hear some of the stuff he does, where back then he kind of had a little bit more flow to him. So he kind of was able to fit in that mold of being the next guitar hero working with Dave. But, kudos to him for continuing to keep going, because, I mean, at this point, he'd been doing it for, he's approaching the 30-year mark, at that point. So good for him.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it did. Again, it put him back on the map, and he would be a staple out in the road for many, many years afterwards. And it was like when he came back, he grew his hair back out. Made It Blonde again. And then he was doing these shows where they were, 15, 16 Van Halen songs and maybe one or two of his own solo songs. And they were playing bars, clubs. It was the return of a great period of me going to see him pretty much once a year, every time he played somewhere, whether it be a theater.
Yep. I remember you mentioning that you saw him a bunch of times down your way. So
yeah,
that's awesome.
So it was the genesis of it. But Bill, we all have our love for Deep Purple. Bill, I know you and I have talked about this, and Ian. Deep Purple released Abandon this year, and I have to admit that I was on such a high coming off of Perpendicular from 2 years prior that I was expecting just great things to come every single time. And, I will say I like this album, but I don't love it the way I loved Perpendicular, because it was a heavier, darker album. It just wasn't as memorable. But again, I was just thankful that, we were able to get another new album from Deep Purple. And what was even better was the summer tour that came out that year in 98, which was a co-headlining tour of Deep Purple, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, with Dream Theater opening. I saw that a couple times and was great. But Bill, what was your impressions of Abandon?
Yeah, same thing. It's it's not a bad album. It's just it's not very memorable and definitely not as good as Perpendicular was to me. I really can't say of even any standout tracks that I remember, and unfortunately I didn't get that tour in Florida. You're lucky you got to see that. That definitely didn't come down to Florida. But yeah, I mean it's just sort of there. I mean, it's cool they were putting out records at the time, but it was kind of a weird time to even be listening to Deep Purple, I guess. 1998,
Yeah.
people weren't thinking that way,
Yeah.
Kind
How
of
about you,
ironic.
Ian?
Yeah, I was going to say it's kind of ironic that you have, Deep Purple putting out a heavy, dark album the same year that, Sabbath reunites, and they had just gotten done, dropping some new material. I thought Abandon was good. It kind of, you can see where, if you look at it from the prog side of things, how it definitely was fitting in with some of the bands of what was, and what was going on, when you look from like a Tool and, maybe some Dream Theater. And, at this point, I think it's right around now is when the infancy of like Porcupine Tree and some of these other bands are coming. It definitely fit the mark in there. And maybe with some of those, like a Godsmack type fan to want to appreciate them. It was, you guys are right though. I mean, it was way different than what Perpendicular was. Perpendicular kind of had just this vibe across the whole album, when it came out. This still had some of the mojo, but it was different, I think, just because of how they were trying to write or what they were trying to do. But I agree, it's still not a bad album. I mean, it's it's definitely something you could listen to and still enjoy it. So
Yeah, exactly. It's funny, if you ever think of a year in metal where you can say in 1 year there were new releases from Kiss, Metallica, Van Halen, Iron Maiden, Deep Purple, right? You'd say, oh my God, this is a monumental year. Well, guess what? All of these bands released new albums in 1998. It's just with mixed opinions on these things. So maybe we talk a little bit about Metallica along with Jerry Cantrell, because they were a summer tour package in 98. I saw them at Giant Stadium in New Jersey. It was Jerry Cantrell, Days of the New, and Metallica out in the stadium. Jerry Cantrell had just released his first solo album called Boggy Depot. It was his debut, and it had some cool songs. Cut You In, My Song, between very catchy, melodic type songs, like very radio accessible. But as you said earlier, Ian, like, would this one really be a top album if this was on a different year? Probably not. It was just a nod to, making sure that we were happy that Jerry was out there putting new music out, because this was his first new piece of music released in a couple years.
Yeah, I think, I mean, being that he's a guy that was one of the key writers in Alice in Chains. It's not impossible for him to write material that's going to sound like Alice in Chains. The problem I had with it sounded like some of the stuff was maybe too much leftover from Alice in Chains, maybe stuff that he had on the cutting room floor. Lane passes away, and well, I really don't want to see those songs die on the vine, so I'm going to take them and I'm going to use it. I thought that there could have been more consistency across this album as well. It's not a terrible album, but it's definitely not something that I'd be like, oh, I got to go listen to Boggy Depot. There's some good stuff on there. And yes, definitely hearing Jerry playing again, getting, his, just that vibe and his voice and, everything he's got going on with his playing. I mean, it was definitely pretty cool to have that happen.
And just to get to know that you're going to see him out there on the road again. I remember I think he had Sean Kinney from Alice in Chains at the time. He was his drummer, and he had the singer from Fishbone, believe it or not, was in the band. I don't remember the guy's name, but he's had a lot of guys come and go. Eventually he had Michael Borden, Robert Trujillo in his touring band. But it was also cool because I always loved Alice in Chains, so it was nice that there was another reason to get out there and get some new music and see him live. But Bill, speaking of Metallica, they released Garage Inc. The cool part of this is it contained one side of the album was all these sort of new covers, either new cover songs or new compilations. What were some of the memorable ones to you that were released on this package?
Oh, definitely the Merciful Fate. I mean, that was like, wow, no shit. I mean, I remember when I was very surprised they did that. Not surprised because I knew that they had actually met and hung out and whatever when they were recording Ride the Lightning, but just 1998 they bust out with that. I was like, wow, okay, that's cool. And I'm trying to think the Sabracadabra, they did a killer version of that. I still dig that to this day. I hear it every once in a while and I'm like, they did a good job on that song.
And the Bob Seger classic Turn the Page, which became, a song that I guess it's, again, one of those covers that, like you were saying, Ian or Bill earlier with, the cover of Gary Newman's Cars by Fear Factory, right? It became a reason to play the song on the radio. This one was still
a huge hit.
Yeah, Turn the Page.
Still gets
You're
played.
hearing on XM. You hear it on XM all the time.
Right.
And, it's a Bob Seger song to me. It's not a Metallica song, but it kept them on the radio. I had a cool memory of this.
If I'm going to reach for a Metallica tune, I'm not playing that one, but whatever.
I'm with you. It's the Sabracadabra or the Merciful Fate medley.
But I mean, The other one that was a pretty good single for them was their cover of Whiskey in a Jar by Thin Lizzy.
That's right. Yep.
That was stomping. And
I don't mind that. I know some people that hate that, but I like the original version. So I thought it was a cool nod to Thin Lizzy,
Absolutely. And then, nod to Pepper from COC jumping in with them. They did Tuesday's Gone with the Wind by Skinnerd. And that was just Pepper playing a slide guitar on there, man. I mean, they killed it, getting in there, jamming together and stuff like that. So I think overall it had some pretty decent stuff, but the nod back to the older stuff is the thing that, we're all going to appreciate more, especially when you get some good rockers out of it, so.
You look at it from a commercial success, the more we talk about it, it almost seems like Metallica can do no wrong. I mean, here it is. They were just making a small effort to create like some newness to the original Garage Days EP, and here they go and get not just one hit but four. Right? Probably unexpected. I think, although I didn't see the show, I do remember them playing the Roseland Ballroom, Bill, where I thought this was really clever of them. They played a set of only covers. And they had a Metallica tribute band open up for them who only played Metallica songs. And that's such a Metallica creativity. Yep. Look it up. It's a big piece of Metallica history.
That's awesome. Shit. I probably heard about that and just forgot about it, but that's pretty wild.
That's awesome.
They may have done a couple of shows, but I know for sure Roseland Ballroom was one of them. But, again, here you go as as we say, load and reload, and that era wasn't the greatest. They come back and they just kick us in the ass again. So, but moving along to let's say the last two for today's episode, Iron Maiden and Kiss. So Iron Maiden releases Virtual X, the second release with singer Blaze Bayley. When we talked about the replacement singers, Ian, in our special episode last year, I felt that this was a bit of a clunker. The song Future Real was okay. The Klansman, I think, is a standout Iron Maiden classic. But aside from that, I don't reach to this album. And I always remember the summer tour where they played the Roseland. It was like on a weeknight in July. Dio opened, and I just remember the place being, there was so much space on that floor you could have walked around. And I was like, wow, look where the mighty have fallen.
Yep. And it's, the sad part about it is when you listen to some of the material, and I think we discussed this before, when you listen to some of the material, you can hear where there was some potential, but it's like taffy. They just stretched it out way too much. If they had cut off some of the loose stuff and just, made it more compact, they probably could have come up with, 5 or 6, 7, pretty killer songs. But some of the stuff, it got mundane, with Harris just kind of dragging it out, these long features and stuff like that. Klansman, no, it's still a pretty good tune. And I think they played it not long ago with Bruce, right?
It was the tour 2 years ago. They played it. That's been
right,
in and out of their set list since Bruce came back in '99. So that one's been a staple for them.
Yep. So
yeah, that's the only tune that I could say I like on that album. It's just, again, it was a clunker. And like you said, Ian, and they still to this day do that. They just write these long parts that just don't need to be there. This doodle doodle, like, all right, move on. Come on.
Yeah.
I love Maiden, but man, they meander a lot.
Oh yeah.
And I don't know what they're thinking with some of their picks, like Blaze Bayley. I mean, the guy's he's a good singer. I just would have never ever picked him to be an Iron Maiden. I don't know if they were at the pub, like having a few and went, hey, join the band. I don't remember how that happened, but
this is true. Well, it's a piece of their history anyway, just like we were talking about in some of these albums. But let's say we're going to end this, guys, with the Kiss. The new album. Now, listen, I'm not going to lie. Huge Kiss fan. I was excited for the reunion, saw all the tours. And when news came out that, oh, my God, the 4 original members are reuniting and they're going to make a brand new album, who couldn't be happier than me and every other Kiss fan? And the title track, Psycho Circus, welcome to the show, right? Big opening track, killer guitar riffs. What a way to open up like the album that opened up the tour. We really thought and expected great things on this album, but at the end of the day, clunker.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think that the hype, and you get the debut single, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, this is formulaically sounds like a progression of old Kiss. It's like they decided to say, okay, we're going to go back to 79, 1980, right when everything was falling apart and we had to replace guys, and we're going to continue from there. And it seemed like it might work. And then you get into it, and it's like, it's really not that good. It's okay, but it's really not that good, and it's sad because, the album looked like an old Kiss album, it's got the, everything going on with it. You're thinking, oh, this is going to be awesome. There's got to be a poster in here someplace or something. But, there was nothing. It's too bad.
You got 3D glasses. 3D glasses came in the packaging if you bought the CD.
That's right. Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there was the Gene song Within, I remember, was kind of cool. It was almost like they made an attempt to copy themselves. Like Within was like a modern version of God of Thunder. And then Ace had the track Into the Void, which was like, again, that was like another one of his Shock Me or, 2000 Man or something like that. So there were definitely some attempts on it. But I mean, typical Kiss history, you find this stuff out years later, but I don't even remember. But then you find out that like Ace and Peter really didn't play on the album. You know, same bullcrap we were exposed from back in the 70s albums. It wasn't really the four of them.
Yeah. And
I figured as much, because even if you listen to that record, it just doesn't really sound like Ace, you know? And
No.
And I don't know, you guys, I'm sure you saw that tour, right?
Yes.
I saw it, and Ace, I don't when I saw Ace, he was a wreck. Like, I remember during his guitar solo, he was kind of flubbing a bit, and then his guitar's smoking, and he goes to put it on the thing, and he was like, and he kept missing the ring that he hooks it on, and they, carry it away. I was just like, oh, Ace, come on, dude.
Right.
Yeah, it was pretty sad. I love Kiss. I mean, they're my first band, my first love.
All of ours.
The thing that stood out to me with when you hear this, knowing that it's not Ace, listen to all the material that Ace has put out since then. And all of it sounds like Ace rewriting old Ace stuff from the 70s. Every one of them sounds like it's just done with modern production. That's the one thing that separates it, where like Kiss, at least as a band, when Ace was gone, they were able to progress in their sound of writing, where Ace is kind of in this block, and everything he does is that block. He just moves it from this year to the, whatever year.
What's the album that came out in 2009?
When
Sonic,
he did
Sonic something.
The Kiss album. Anyway, that's what Psycho Circus should have sounded like, if you ask me. Because that album sounds like a continuation of like Rock and Roll Over or something.
Yeah.
And Psycho Circus just didn't capture that. It was like it was forced. You know what I mean? Like they forced something that wasn't there.
I'm sure that it was Tommy Thayer was one of the guitar players involved with the freaking Psycho Circus.
Most likely, because he wasn't he their tour manager at the time, or their stage manager or something like that?
He was, and I think he was Ace's guitar tech for a while too.
Yes, that's right.
But I'm sure he somehow was on that album playing.
Oh yeah. Gene has an ulterior motive for everything. He's always got something planned.
Yeah.
Right. Well, but again, it kept us going to the concerts. It gave us some new news and a reason to go out to the Meadowlands Arena, out to the arenas in Tampa and wherever you guys lived in the States to see them once again. And the journey with Kiss would not end, as we'll get to future episodes. We'll hear more about some of their, farewell tours that continued on and on and on. But guys, this concludes the year 1998. We only have one more year to go in the decade, and then we get into the 2000s, and that's where I think the rebirth of metal starts again. And for you listeners, we're going to make a promise that in 2025, we're going to release one episode a month. This year, we were a little bit lagging, one episode a month. So hopefully we'll catch up to real time in about 3 years from now. So don't forget to visit metalmayhemroc.com to sign up for our newsletter and stay updated on new podcast episodes, both on YouTube and as podcasts, CD and concert reviews, and listen to the live radio show Monday nights on Metal Devastation Radio. And of course, if you like our content, subscribe to us and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. So for my guests, Bill the Rager and Ian O'Rourke, I'm Metal Walt, and this is Metal Mayhem ROC.
Metal for life.
Thank you for listening to Metal Mayhem ROC. Check out our website at metalmayhemroc.com for information on podcasts, archives, links to all our live radio shows, and all sorts of info. Please like, follow, and share with everyone, even your non-metal friends. And always remember to keep it heavy.